Welcome to Ghost Vibes. The year is 1888. The place is Whitechapel, London, a district defined by poverty, fog, and utter hopelessness. In the space of just 10 weeks, a single elusive figure carved a permanent scar across the face of criminal history. He was never caught, never identified, and his name is synonymous with pure, cold terror: Jack the Ripper. Our story begins with the canonical five, the five women whose horrific murders are definitively attributed to the Ripper, primarily due to the shocking and particular brutality of their disfigurement. The victims were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. The killings were not random acts of violence. They followed a terrifying, escalating pattern, suggesting a killer who was gaining confidence and proficiency with each act. Mary Ann Nichols, the first canonical victim, was found with deep slashes to her throat and minor abdominal mutilation. Annie Chapman, murdered just over a week later, showed signs of more extensive and surgical mutilation. The speed and precision of the attacks are a critical element of the Ripper's legend. Whitechapel was a densely populated area, patrolled by police and constantly buzzing with late-night activity. Yet the killer was able to corner his victims, execute the brutal acts, and vanish into the labyrinthine alleys and back streets of the East End, all without leaving any substantive witnesses or physical evidence. This suggested a man who knew the area intimately, perhaps a local resident, or one with a professional ability to appear and disappear in the dark. The terror reached its peak with the double event: the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes on the same night, September 30th, 1888. The murder of Eddowes was particularly bold. She was attacked in Mitre Square, a small enclosed space, suggesting a profound level of arrogance and disregard for capture. The mutilations found on Eddowes were the most medically complex yet, leading police to officially hypothesize that the killer possessed anatomical or surgical knowledge. This theory, that the Ripper was a doctor, butcher, or some type of medically trained professional, was amplified by the final and most gruesome canonical murder, that of Mary Jane Kelly. Kelly's body was found mutilated beyond recognition in her own room. This was the only murder committed indoors, suggesting the killer finally felt secure enough to take his time, fully indulging his terrifying surgical fantasies. The intensity of this final crime terrified not just the community, but Scotland Yard itself. The killer had essentially dared the police to catch him, and they had failed. The hunt was on for a highly specific kind of monster, a methodical sadist with a profound knowledge of the human body. The investigation into the Whitechapel murders quickly became a case study in investigative failure, compounded by intense public scrutiny and a chaotic media landscape. Scotland Yard, accustomed to dealing with petty thieves and routine violence, was utterly unprepared for a killer of the Ripper's unique psychological profile. One of the primary investigative obstacles was the sheer volume of misinformation. Whitechapel was a place of deep societal distrust, where residents feared the police almost as much as the killer. Witnesses were often unreliable, conflicting, or simply too terrified to speak. The police efforts, led by Inspector Frederick Aberline, were hampered by lack of forensic science. Fingerprint analysis was in its infancy, and DNA evidence was decades away. The primary tools were boots on the ground, witness sketches, and bloodhounds, which often failed miserably in the crowded, muddy streets. The second and most famous investigative distraction was the Zodiac-like campaign of letters sent to the police and newspapers. These letters, dozens of them, were mostly hoaxes sent by opportunists seeking fame or chaos. However, three communications stood out as potentially authentic: the Dear Boss letter, where the killer first used the name Jack the Ripper, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell letter. The From Hell letter was uniquely disturbing because it was accompanied by a small human kidney, preserved in alcohol. The sender claimed it was from one of the victims, Catherine Eddowes, stating he had fried and ate it. This ghastly package both terrified the public and intensified the belief among investigators that they were hunting a man who was deeply depraved and likely suffering from a mental disorder, possibly paranoid megalomania. While the authenticity of the Dear Boss and Saucy Jackie notes is still debated by forensic linguists, the impact of the name Jack the Ripper was instantaneous and global, giving the killer an immortal identity far beyond the victims he so violently erased. The crucial link that emerged from the few credible witnesses was the description of a man seen with Annie Chapman and Catherine Eddowes, a foreigner, or a man with a distinct, military-like bearing, perhaps wearing unusual dark clothing. This information led police to focus on two distinct groups, local butchers and slaughtermen, whose work provided both the necessary knives and the familiarity with blood, and, controversially, educated men, whose surgical skills matched the horrific mutilations. The pressure from the public and the press was immense. Newspapers sensationalized every murder, often publishing graphic details that fueled panic across London. This media frenzy created a feedback loop. The Ripper, if he was indeed following the news, saw his crimes elevated to national significance, likely feeding his narcissistic urge to continue his spree. The failure to secure a single definitive piece of evidence or a credible witness allowed the killer to maintain his terrifying anonymity. By November 1888, after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, the killings abruptly stopped. The terror ended not because the police caught him, but because the Ripper simply melted back into the shadows from which he came. The abrupt end of the Ripper killings left Scotland Yard and the public reeling, forcing a shift in the investigation from active manhunt to a decades-long pursuit of retrospective suspects. The official files, known as the A files, contain hundreds of names, but only a handful have ever garnered serious consideration, largely because they fit the terrifying profile of the killer, a man with surgical skill and a deep-seated hatred for women. The suspect list is notoriously complex, divided mainly between members of the aristocracy, local Whitechapel residents, and those with medical knowledge. Montague John Druitt, the nobleman theory. Druitt was a barrister and an assistant schoolmaster who was heavily favored by some senior police officials at the time. He had medical training and his family committed him to an asylum shortly before the murders stopped. He died mysteriously in the Thames in December 1888. The theory was that his death marked the end of the murders, but the evidence was purely circumstantial and lacked any direct link to the crime scenes. 2. Aaron Kosminski, the local suspect, a Jewish immigrant and local hairdresser who suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. He was named as a key suspect by Inspector Donald Swanson in his private notes, claiming Kosminski was identified by a key witness who refused to testify in court. Modern DNA analysis in 2014 and 2019, though highly controversial and disputed by the scientific community due to contamination issues, claimed a partial match to evidence found on one of the victim's shawls, renewing interest in the local angle. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, the royal conspiracy, the most outlandish yet enduring theory. Proponents claim the killer was Queen Victoria's grandson, sometimes arguing the murders were covered up to hide a child he had fathered with one of the victims. This theory is almost universally dismissed by serious historians, but it illustrates the deep societal need to believe the killer was an aristocratic madman rather than a commoner. However, a single candidate consistently drew the attention of high-ranking police officials and possesses a highly unique, dark profile that connects him directly to the surgical element of the crime: Francis Tumblety. Tumblety was an American quack doctor, known for being a charismatic yet deeply misogynistic individual. He styled himself as a herbalist and was known to possess a disturbing collection of uteri and other female organs, which he kept in jars. Tumblety lived and operated in London in the late 1880s, primarily near the Whitechapel district. He publicly expressed a virulent hatred for women, especially prostitutes, whom he called vermin. This extreme misogyny fit the psychological profile derived from the mutilations perfectly. Crucially, Tumblety was under active surveillance by Scotland Yard detectives around the time of the final murders. He was arrested in London on an unrelated charge, gross indecency. But fearing involvement in the murder investigation, he managed to escape bail and fled to New York on a forged passport in November 1888, the exact month the Ripper murders stopped. His subsequent disappearance back into the American underworld, coupled with his medical knowledge, his known hatred for the victim demographic, and the timing of his flight from London, makes him one of the most compelling and terrifying figures on the suspect list. Tumblety was not just a convenient suspect. He was a documented person of interest whose unique peculiarities aligned eerily with the savage events in Whitechapel. Francis Tumblety's sudden panicked flight from London in November 1888 is the single most damning piece of circumstantial evidence linking him to the Ripper crimes. As the intensity of the police investigation mounted, Tumblety, already out on bail for a separate, unrelated crime, saw his window of opportunity closing. He knew he was being watched, and his unconventional life, combined with his open hatred of women, made him a prime target. Tumblety escaped England by taking the SS city of Chester to New York, arriving in the United States just as the last canonical Ripper murder was receding from the headlines. The news of the notorious London killer quickly followed him across the Atlantic. Upon his arrival in New York, the U.S. authorities, alerted by Scotland Yard, immediately took an interest in the eccentric doctor. The New York Police Department, NYPD, launched its own discreet investigation, noting that Tumblety continued his bizarre behavior, dressing in androgynous clothing and maintaining his volatile public rants against women. NYPD detectives gathered reports that Tumblety was highly adept at disguise and had a habit of carrying surgical-style knives. The profile was terrifyingly consistent with what Scotland Yard was seeking. The most critical element of the Tumblety case is the chronological overlap. The documented timeline is brutally clear: August-November 1888. The Ripper commits the canonical 5 murders while Tumblety is living and practicing in London. November 1888, mid-month. Tumblety skips bail and flees London for New York. November 9, 1888. The final canonical murder of Mary Jane Kelly occurs. Post-November 1888. The murders in Whitechapel cease completely. To many top investigators, this chronological coincidence was too powerful to ignore. Inspector John Littlechild, the head of the special branch at Scotland Yard, later wrote a private letter to an American colleague in 1913, explicitly naming Tumblety as the strongest suspect. Littlechild indicated that if Tumblety had not fled, the London police were preparing to seek a warrant for his arrest based on strong presumptive evidence and his documented history of violent misogyny. The question of why the police never officially named Tumblety or pursued extradition lies in the limitations of 19th century criminal justice. The case against Tumblety was circumstantial. There was no DNA, no eyewitness who could definitively place him with a victim at the moment of death, and no murder weapon recovered. Extradition was a complicated process, and without a solid forensic link, London police were wary of risking an acquittal that would damage their reputation further. Tumblety continued to live in America, occasionally moving between New York and Rochester, dying in 1903. His death closed the door on any potential confession or discovery. The case illustrates a disturbing truth about the Ripper. The killer likely had a known identity and was actively sought by the authorities, but the lack of modern forensic tools and his timely escape allowed him to slip away, leaving behind a historical question that would forever eclipse the man himself. The legacy of Jack the Ripper is not just the memory of the gruesome murders, but the enduring psychological portrait of a killer who achieved immortality through anonymity. While the formal investigation ended with the cessation of the murders, the subsequent century of Ripperology has focused heavily on the terrifying implications of the killer's profile. The surgical precision of the mutilation suggests 2 profound psychological factors: power and dehumanization. By targeting vulnerable women and removing internal organs, the killer was enacting the ultimate violation, reducing his victims from people to objects of scientific curiosity or ritualistic sacrifice. This points to a highly organized personality, someone able to control the crime scene, suppress all emotion, and conduct the savage acts with speed and efficiency. This profile aligns perfectly with the educated, methodical, yet secretly depraved character of Francis Tumblety. Tumblety's life offers a terrifying potential answer to the Ripper's motivation. His public and documented hatred of women, especially fallen women, a term often used for prostitutes, provides a clear, visceral motive for the specific victim demographic. His profession as a self-styled doctor gave him access to the necessary tools and anatomical knowledge. In this framework, the Ripper crimes were not random acts of violence, but a terrifying, targeted ideological mission rooted in extreme misogyny and pathological narcissism. The official lack of closure in the Ripper case forced the police and the public to confront the limitations of their legal system. Jack the Ripper was the first celebrity serial killer of the modern age. a ghost created by the combination of industrial poverty, tabloid journalism, and the sheer audacity of his crimes. His continued mystery fueled a cultural fascination that persists today, sparking countless books, films, and endless debates. The ultimate closure on the Ripper case may lie in acceptance rather than discovery. The Ripper's identity remains officially unknown, and despite occasional attempts at modern DNA analysis, which are heavily criticized due to the contamination of 19th century evidence, no conclusive, legally sound proof has ever emerged. However, the circumstantial and behavioral case against suspects like Francis Tumblety provides the strongest historical framework for a solution. Tumblety embodies the terrifying figure that police suspected all along, a man capable of moving effortlessly between the civilized and the savage, whose timely flight saved him from a likely conviction. Jack the Ripper remains the phantom of Whitechapel. His legend is a dark reminder that some of history's most terrifying individuals can simply step back into the crowd, their crimes solved not by discovery, but by an unexplained, enduring silence. Tumblety may have died in America in obscurity, but his long shadow remains cast over the foggy streets of London, forever linked to the most haunting unsolved murder spree in history.